Okay, great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay. So thanks for joining us again this week. In the last 2 weeks, we've talked about the earlier stages of disaster mitigation, response, and resilience. And this week, we're talking about the response part of the disaster cascade. And it's a really interesting topic because it is often a neglected topic when we're talking to agencies, individuals, as well as providers, and mainly because people have a very hard time separating preparedness and recovery. So we're going to go over some of the nuances and talk about some tools that help us in this particular setting, but we're also going to talk about kind of why this is an area that has been a little more neglected as it relates to information, as well as advice. And this is kind of what I was mentioning just now. What is the real difference between preparedness and response? And we're specifically asking this question as it relates to practice. I think theoretically we understand what this means. We definitely have a lot of exposure to media, as well as possibly personal experience that kind of creates an image of these two parts of the disaster response cascade. You know, preparedness, I think we think a lot about those activities we talked about in the last 2 weeks. What are we planning to do? What are we planning to have? This is kind of your go back activity, any of those, you know, as the word suggests, pre-event activities, where response is, I think we usually think of emergency response, images we see on TV when the event is at its climax. These tend to have very separate meanings and connotations, but when we're putting this at the ground level, we really need to understand the differences between these two, but also where they blend, because they absolutely do. But as we find out a little bit later, as we discuss briefly later, response is something that has to be measured sort of as a risk. We have to decide whether response is appropriate for either us as individuals or our agencies. So we'll look a little bit into, you know, is it appropriate for me or even my community or for my agency to be responding, and is it even possible? So welcome to our other participant. We're just talking about the differences between the response period, the preparedness period, and the recovery period, because these things do tend to blend from the agency level. So again, we're talking about the quote-unquote fourth stage. These stages can really be broken down into more nuanced stages, but they can also be combined. Many organizations or even response efforts don't necessarily bring this into, you know, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, prevention. I would say prevention and mitigation are often left out. But in our context, we're talking about the fourth stage of this particular model, which includes response. Oh, excuse me. So when we're talking about just kind of plain definitions, the fourth stage is about containing or mitigating loss. This is kind of in response to those risk assessment questions we were talking about. So hopefully the work has been done in order to understand what risks there are. And then in this stage, we're enacting those plans to mitigate those risks that have, to mitigate those damages that have been identified by risks. There are many ways to do this. We did talk about some tools. One of the tools we talked about last week had to do with, 2 weeks ago had to do with communication. How at risk are we in the event of an actual disaster to spread misinformation? How likely are we to cause harm as agents? So this is the period we're talking about is the period in which all that work is coming into fruition. So this stage is also one in which order is meant to be restored. This is different than recovery. Order in this context relates to kind of reducing violence, ceasing violence, and this isn't always in a disaster context, but this is to stop any of those high-yielding risks in their tracks. Recovery is about responding to the damages this stage is about stopping those damages, whether this is, from a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. So order restoration is a huge part of this. And again, there's that question of, do all of us as agents have a responsibility in this particular part of disaster response? Or is this something that maybe we should be leaving to other entities? And we'll also have some tools to help you kind of figure that out. And the final piece of this particular part of response is reestablishing normality. Again, this is really tightly linked to recovery, but when we're talking about in the immediate response portion, we are kind of talking about what can be done to service communities, populations, individuals, agencies in the moment that creates the stepping stones to normality. And again, we're going to talk a little bit about, what is normal, what is baseline, if you want to use that word. Not all communities have the same definition of normality. And it's right there on the bottom, what is normal and what is order. And sometimes the systems that develop during the response period and after are different looking than the initial understanding of normal as well as order, for better or for worse. So when we're talking about disaster response, I think it's important for me to acknowledge that these are the entities, and hopefully you're familiar with them. I imagine you're familiar with the city of New Orleans, but these are the entities that we're really looking at when it concerns proper and well-infrastructured response. Because again, we're talking about a period in which the event is possibly still occurring, could be ongoing. Some events, are 2-hour rain events, low risk, low casualty, low morbidity, as one would hope. And some events are days, weeks, hopefully not months. I can't really think of any disaster in history that impended over months. Something like this, though, might be a drought. But these are typically uncommon in well-infrastructured communities. And usually a long-running disaster is secondary to failures or blind spots in infrastructure. So it's almost like they're man-made more than natural. So when we think about immediate response, this is really emergency response. This is, I think, what most people think of when they think of disaster response. And, this is often, again, lumped into recovery. But for now, we're talking about event-based timeframes. And, many organizations actively discuss before and after, but not many understand who they are during. And honestly, that is very common and something I think that needs to be more thoroughly discussed, because it's hard to understand, what is my place during a disaster? What are my resources? And this is often because we can't measure every risk or anticipate every risk. So again, these are the entities that I would say are most formally involved in disaster response in the city of New Orleans, sometimes Louisiana, but these are very specific to the city of New Orleans. We have the city itself. We have Homeland Security Emergency Preparedness. This is actually where all emergency management activities are housed. This comes to a surprise, as a surprise for many people. Homeland Security is often, associated with activities more around border control. I've worked with people who have been very concerned about their personal safety or status when it comes to utilizing Homeland Security as a agency of support. But the entire disaster management hierarchy and scheme is run under this particular office, NOCEP and GOCEP. And then finally, we have the New Orleans Police, who you can expect to be an integral part of response. This also includes EMS and fire. And then this logo that doesn't have any name or words under it, that's VOAD. These are organizations that voluntarily operate in disaster. And we'll talk a little bit about them. You might be familiar with them. You might actually be one of them. If you are, you can comment in the chat and let me know. But we'll talk a little bit about VOADs and understanding an agency's place and ability during a response period. And again, the response period is often undefined. because there really is a very blurred line between, when we can confidently say the crisis is over and now recovery begins. And that often has to do with the nuances of community, infrastructure, government. If you look at timelines across disasters, within the country in the last maybe 15 years, none of them will align perfectly, even though they all run off the same infrastructure. So it's really interesting to kind of look at those sorts of case studies to get an idea of what is a disaster response period. And the academic answer is very gray. So it's a very interesting topic. I want to illustrate how complicated, and before we really jump into, what can an agency do in the response period? We understand the preparedness period. We are going to talk next week about the recovery period, which I think we're all really intimate with, but the response period is deeply complicated. And this is going to kind of lead us into our next talking point about, should we be doing this, or is this something that we're capable of as an agency or individual? But this is just, I wanted to throw this in here to give you a look at what an emergency framework looks like. It, again, is extremely complicated. ESFs are emergency support functions. These are specific functions in specific fields that respond to certain areas. So ESF 1 is transportation. ESF 12 is energy. Public safety and security is ESF 13. ESF 9 is search and rescue, fire and hazmat, ES 4 and 10. So these things are all split up very specifically and all answer to a specific person, director, liaison, et cetera. And then those people respond to a section chief. I think many of us would fall under 6 and 8. These would be, housing and human services as well as public health. I've typically worked under ESF 8. And again, that is often very strictly run by the city or by fire, police, and EMS. It is very rare to be able to run within a response. Oh, my chat popped up, but I can't see it. So I'm going to try to make this chat work while I'm going to keep talking. So I just wanted to show this to you in order to illustrate how deeply complicated it is, because this kind of leads into our next talking point, which is about, should we be doing this? I'm sorry, I'm trying, my chat isn't, I can see it on the screen. I'm just going to go back really quickly. Oh, my goodness, it's right there. Emergency operations control. I'm so sorry, Emily, I'm going to type that in. All right, guys, sometimes I'm a little new to Zoom. You're very welcome. So that was all leading into kind of this conversation about self-deployment. Many agencies are not actually prepared, to work under this very complicated hierarchy. This is also on, this is a federal hierarchy run under NIMS and ICS, and those are incident commands. So, we need to talk about like self-deployment. If you're not prepared as an agency, it's really easy to want to self-deploy. And I've actually run into a lot of agencies who have had successful self-deployments. And Louisiana is actually known for having, had agencies that have run extremely successful self-deployments. So it's something that is hard to discuss. It's also hard to critique something like this, because often enough in disaster situations, self-deployment can be successful. Now, from an official capacity, we would technically recommend, for safety and for like many reasons, not to self-deploy. So, again, if you look at this, there's a very complicated infrastructure. It is very easy for self-deployment to interrupt this infrastructure and threaten the integrity of response. I really kind of like studying this particular area because I think the urgency and the desire to help is so incredibly ingrained in many agencies. But I think the takeaway from this particular slide and the slide before it is that if an agency has the ability beforehand to decide, what is my identity in a crisis? Because your preparedness operations, your recovery operations, but when it comes to the moment, do we have the capacity? Do we have the correct relationships? Is it safe for us to deploy? Do people know we're deploying? Before deciding to just self-deploy. It's a huge, huge question to ask oneself in this field, and often enough people ask it. They don't go very deep, and they deploy, or they're witnessing crisis, they're witnessing pain, and it's very honorable, but you always want to consider the dangers of self-deployment to the system, and the possible risks that you're incurring. And there's this little bit of words down there. It's spontaneous volunteer management. This is actually one of the biggest burdens in the field of disaster response, are people showing up to disaster sites, showing up outside of agency doors, dumping clothing. Though disaster response behavior can be very positive, it's always important to consider the sides of it that are less helpful. Recently, there was a self-deployed caravan headed to Florida in the most recent hurricane. And one thing that they didn't expect was the amount of litter on the ground. So, this is wood litter, metal litter, all sorts of just stuff that comes out of a hurricane situation. And before they could actually, assist anybody, all the tires on their vehicle popped, because there's a lot of glass, there's nails, there's metal, there's everything. And this was an unexpected barrier to this response that this young team had put together. And, it just displays, you're going to put yourself in a situation that might create a need for you to be rescued from the situation you were going in to help. So I don't anticipate that anyone on here is, someone who's interested in self-deploying or maybe has self-deployed, but it's always important to think of, does this, will this create more harm than good? So these are just some interesting statistics that I pulled up. When we're talking about feeling ready for a natural disaster, about 42 to 51% of Americans say that they're ready for a natural disaster, which is very different than being able to respond to one. 17% think that they're well prepared for a natural disaster to hit with little warning, which is very different than a natural disaster that is time related. So this would be like a hurricane versus a tornado, or a hurricane versus a sudden catastrophic event that usually that falls under the purview of terrorism, something like that. But again, we're talking about natural disasters, and 13% can explain their community's disaster plan. I am very hesitant to say that 13% is accurate across the board to all communities. That number actually seems slightly high to me. If I were to ask anyone in the city of New York the disaster plan for this community of Manhattan, I am not confident anyone would have any grasp on it. I myself am not sure I have a grasp on it. So, this number is not specific. This number is very, very broad, and, may not indicate a specific community's ability to explain their community disaster plan. So I recommend after this, or sometime this week, taking a look at your community's disaster plan, even if it's deeply localized, and seeing how familiar you are with that. Is it a surprise? Is it familiar? Is it exactly what you thought it was? Last week we talked a lot about contraflow, so hopefully you're familiar with sort of anticipating what to do in that situation. But I think you'd be surprised at the nuances that these disaster plans can entail or can include. So this is something I wanted to share to kind of preface talking about how we operate and kind of helping people anticipate what this response period really looks like. This is a graph that we use in disaster management to talk about human behavior in response, specifically across the disaster timeline. And it's actually very well studied and very well utilized. It typically does follow this pattern across most disasters. It's safe to apply this to nearly any context, which is a really useful tool. But this gives you an outline of, what to expect. And I think, it's kind of common sense. You look at this and you think, yeah, that's what I'd anticipate. There's that fight and flight response in stage 1. This is that warning period. This is communication of an event. Then you have the actual impact, the rescue period. Within this period, so we're also going to look at this across an evacuation timeline. But this is, looking at those 2 initial stages that we were talking about, and then moving into response, which includes impact and rescue, and a little bit of this aftermath, depending on the context and the community that you're working within. Because again, some of these disasters last, when we're talking about the crisis event, last longer than others. It especially depends on the resources and infrastructure. The period that comes after just a little into stage 2, that is our recovery period. This is the period that we're really familiar with. This is what people like to watch on TV, but this is also where you start to lose people. This is where donations start to die down. This is, there's that honeymoon period. There's this kind of feeling of solidarity in the post-disaster context. But then, there's this recognized decline, that is very natural when one is grieving land or people, time. And then, we'll talk a little bit more in this next week, but this like long-term recovery, reconstruction phase, this is over years. So, we have in stage 1, this is hours, stage 2, hours to days. The aftermath, this could be days to weeks, could be less, depending on, again, the infrastructure. Looking at Katrina versus looking at Hurricane Sandy, very different stories, very different timeline. And then these last stages, around 4, 5, 6, sometimes 5, 6, could be years. And these are, re-traumatization, long-term programming, and responding to negative outcomes that did not make themselves apparent in the response stage. So these are often a lot of studies around this are mental health, economic, things that take time to adequately measure. There we go. So that's 1 to X days, 1 to X years. Very different kind of scenarios in each stage. And then this is broken down again in a slightly different way. This is how this works as it relates to kind of agency and people who are expected to respond. So we have the same stages. They call them phases in this particular graph. Again, we have this thing up here, old normal. That's a recognition of, changed identities, changed normals. Maybe what we return to isn't what was. Maybe it's better. Maybe it's not as great. But this is really important because this recognizes that there is this sort of turbulence in the post-disaster environment that doesn't just last those couple months or days or weeks, last years. So they also have kind of different names. But what we're concerned about as agencies is, what are we expected to do? So phase 1 is, we're expected to stabilize. We talked about this as it related to communication. How can we stabilize what is coming in as information and then make sure that we put it out in a way that's beneficial, that it's, reliable, that it's verified, that it's safe. We talked a lot about safety of communication in the first module. So that's very much so that they call it the devastation phase, but it really should be that pre-stage. And then phase 2, normalization of disaster response. So this is the agencies, normalizing of their activities. And this is kind of what we're worried about today. And then phase 3 is the emotional, spiritual care, sociocultural as well. There's more to that than just emotional and spiritual. Phase 4, they go deeper into kind of long-term mental health outcomes. So, trying to inspire people to adapt and learn about their new norm. But again, the words that we use around this, we have to be very careful because some people, might not want to hear about them adapting or being empowered. So that's what they're trying to recognize there. So the important things for us to understand as responders, and I don't think any of this is super surprising to you, is that no disaster is the same, which, makes conversations like this difficult sometimes. It makes research exceedingly difficult. If you do a search today on some kind of scholarly website about disaster, you're actually not going to find as much as you hope. It's especially lacking in the higher echelons of research, so like randomized control trials, things like that. Because these contexts are so sudden, so hard to anticipate, and so different, it's hard to create a broadened understanding that kind of assists all practices in development. Again, individuals handle disasters in different ways. We looked at this over the last 2 weeks. It's a really important part of our conversations in development as practitioners, and understanding that not everyone defines these things in the same way. And each disaster requires unique responses from individuals and from the community. So again, this is all about context. Where is this happening? We're talking about Louisiana, New Orleans. But as a practitioner in general, it's always good to take what you can from take lessons learned from other disaster contexts, from other practitioners, to understand how you can apply them to your own context. But if you don't make that response specific, it might not serve the community. What one needs to do in New Orleans might not be suitable to people in Boston, Massachusetts, though they are both communities that deal with a lot of flooding and coastal erosion. So I mentioned before an evacuation timeline. This is Evacuteer's timeline. This is supported by the city-assisted evacuation through the city of New Orleans. We looked somewhat at this last week when we were talking about contraflow, but I imagine this looks somewhat familiar to you. I know Emily can use the chat. Does this look familiar to anybody? Have they seen this before? So it may be, maybe familiar. Does it look reasonable? It's asking for about 72 hours from you. Yeah, those are the hours. So they're talking about 72 hours before landfall. Hour 0 is when the storm would reach the projected point. So this is kind of what they would consider no more movement in and out of the city. This is like the hunkering down stage, as they might call it, right before you start seeing damages. Our -12 in this particular point is the development of the full storm at the point projected. So I'm sorry. So 0 was coastal, -12. I mean, this is like a window. It's not like they take 12 hours every time, but this is kind of the window of the storm developing. This is really, the red is when you really stop seeing activity on the ground. It's really to the discretion of response agencies to whether they'll be active. It depends on the severity of the storm. So this kind of red area is the window in which they acknowledge that, no evacuation is taking place through the city. Absolutely not. But services are extremely limited during this time. So, we have to have a declaration, a disaster declaration. And this is the time in which, the mandatory evacuation is called. The plan for the city is, this somewhat, I don't want to call it complicated. It's very well run. It's very well developed, but it's an immense system that manages, multiple volunteers to evacuate the entirety of people who have both registered and people who show up to evacuate spots. And then, they have this 72-hour window in which this evacuation can happen. So what I think is interesting is, when I first looked at it, I'm like, yeah, this is really reasonable. But does anyone have any feelings about how easy this could be, or what might come up if, you were to express this to a client? Do you think this is as straightforward as this kind of timeline makes it? And we don't have Ashley on today. I know that she has many opinions on this. But the answer is probably not. Oh, I'm missing a slide. All right. Well, what I had here before was kind of looking at this timeline from another perspective. You know, at the 72-hour mark, the 58-hour mark, this might be the window in which people are thinking, yeah, maybe I'm fine. Maybe I'm not going to evacuate. This window might be from 72 hours to 0 hours. The decision-making process is not encapsulated. Human behavior is not encapsulated. It's very hard to predict whether people will be able to adhere to a timeline because these are two things that operate somewhat separately. You know, you have human emotion, behavior, and context kind of fighting a deeply scheduled infrastructure that relies on time. So I'm sure that all of you have or are familiar with disaster stories or narratives, or maybe you have your own disaster experiences, but, you know, though time is always a moving force in the decision-making process, it is not necessarily working in favor with the person or the community making these decisions. So, you know, for me, my decision-making might happen between 72 and 58. For someone else, they really might decide at hour 12 that things are getting scary for them. So when we think about response, we have to think about how can we support our clients, our agents, you know, other agencies, ourselves in adhering or working around very tight windows and working with the infrastructure available to us. So a lot of this, I'm not sure if you went over it yet in your mental health trainings or your mental health modules, but a lot of this is about shifting behaviors and trying to help people learn about, you know, how am I likely to make decisions in contexts like this? And that's not necessarily my, I don't think I could give advice on that without being a mental health practitioner, but we know that a lot of the issues that come around evacuation have deeply to do with, you know, personal risk assessment behaviors, which, you know, are very complicated. So these again are the challenges. Oh, you know what, the slide comes after this. So, you know, the questions that we were talking about before, you know, can I even evacuate? Can I get out of here? We have city assisted evacuation, but what if I have, you know, multiple dogs? Evacuateer can handle that, but like, what if I have all these animals? What if I have no landing spot? What if I have limited funding? You know, what do I do if I have a family member that doesn't want to go with me? You know, can I just shelter in place? I have definitely thought this about many, you know, quote unquote emergencies and storms and disasters, because the, you know, easiest and most attractive thing to do is to mitigate stress and say, hey, I'm gonna ride it out. And, you know, if I do it, do I even have enough money or food or water to do any of this stuff? If I travel, where am I going? Last week we looked at travel times and expenses for specific evacuation points, and they were astronomical. And we are pretty confident that they weren't necessarily indicative of real costs. I think Alexandria was $750-ish, $750 to $850 for a 3-day evacuation with more than 22 hours in the car. And, you know, even if that is accurate, that's a big decision to make. And you know, how much time do I have before the event occurs? If you don't have television or you're not familiar with that evacuation timeline, which I'm certain that the majority of people are not, even though the information's available, at what point did you learn of the event? You know, after that, when did you have time to process the event, communicate the event to your family, friends, loved ones, make plans? You might be at hour 0 by the time that entire process for you is complete. So it's an extremely, extremely nuanced kind of behavioral pathway that has been crammed into an infrastructure, again, that, you know, relies on time and efficiency. So yeah, this is how that timeline differs. I put it after that point, but, you know, preparation can occur in the 72nd hour. It can, you know, hopefully occur weeks, months before, as we were talking about in the first and second weeks. And then where does our decision making happen? For many people, in many storms that have occurred or disasters that have occurred across the country, the decision making happens during the height of the disaster. And we've seen that, you know, with people driving their cars down roads that are now flooded, deciding to leave hurricane-impacted areas during the event. So it really is, like we were saying before, it's very, very different than what is anticipated by the structures that create these timelines. And then reaction, we're going to talk more about that next week. That's more about the recovery period. So what we know about response is that the unprepared still have to respond. So no matter what we talked about in week 1 and 2, no matter how much communicating we have done, no matter how much risk assessment, no matter how prepared we feel as agencies, we will encounter people, whether it's in our own communities or people that we work with, who have to respond and have not prepared, maybe haven't psychologically processed the event at all or the impending event. And we have to understand, what can we do for these people when we are ourselves in a state of emergency or crisis. And we also have to recognize, this is very important, I think, especially for the mental health of responders, that we can't control what a client does during a disaster. We can give resources, we can connect people to teams that may assist during a disaster. Again, there is a window for these things, but we can't control what people ultimately decide to do. What we do instead is focus on offering tools and resources to create these environments of improved agency. And when we're talking about agency, we're talking about the ability to make these decisions from a place of personal empowerment. Really, this is a conversation about, as agencies, helping with those kind of behavioral nuances, assuming that this is within the ability of the agency. But, providing those resources and support, or even referral connection, that is a big way of managing that. So this is just to reiterate, we were talking a lot about technology last week. In a disaster, it's kind of hard to assess whether, technology is going to work. There are days, I remember in New Orleans, where technology didn't work and there was no reason for it. In New York City, I have issues with tech all the time, and I'm in the middle of Manhattan. So, it's hard to kind of put a high amount of value sometimes on these sort of things, but it's a really good idea to at least be prepared and set up your phones to be following these sorts of agencies. Again, GOSEP, this is where you're going to hear all of your primary information. I really do recommend using these as a primary source of verified information, because these are the decision makers. I follow GOSEP, extremely useful, really worth your time to kind of hear what these folks are saying. Sewage and Water Board, I do like to follow what they have going on, but there's a lot of nuance in history with SWB. So that's actually something you have to consider when you're kind of following these agencies, and think about community trust building, things like that. NOLA Ready, this is part of GOSEP. So again, a very highly valid source. This is very much so geared towards the individual. They are definitely developing more community-based response materials, but this is where you should send anybody who's like, how can I as an individual, prepare my finances, get those materials that I need, and they publish in multiple languages. I highly recommend them. And then I don't think any of these are really a big surprise. Entergy, we all know what Entergy is. City of New Orleans, Avacuteer, who we discussed in the first week. NOLA Traffic, because we all love to know about how long we're going to be stuck in traffic. And the NWS of New Orleans. Also things like NOAA. Any weather stations are very valid, but also you have the risk of inundating yourself and your clients with information. So, it's always a good idea to kind of have here's some recommended agencies to follow, something that you don't have to set up, do before you anticipate any sort of event. So, if something's going on and you're in that window before, the storm or the event makes landfall, within that window you can follow and help your decision making. Hopefully these things are available to you when the event is occurring, but for those critical decision-making hours, it's important to have as much information that is valid to you as possible, as well as to your clients. So that's why, this is where that gray sort of area we're talking about with response and preparedness is coming from, because this is technically a preparedness technique, but it will absolutely serve you in the response period. So VOADs. These are voluntary organizations active in disaster. There's a national chapter, and then there's state-specific chapters. I highly recommend looking into becoming a VOAD if it's within your mission and ability and interest. If not, that's not a big deal. Not every agency is meant to respond, but there are a lot of support mechanisms in place for those of you who want to be involved in a VOAD, and I highly recommend checking out their meetings. On the right, there's the Louisiana specific point of contact, Mr. Manning out of the Great Baton Rouge Food Bank, and they're very responsive and extremely friendly, always willing to talk to you one-on-one about how can my agency respond. And what they can help you do is understand, what is my capacity to respond? Should I even be responding? I also recommend talking to the City of New Orleans directly. They're actually very amicable and open to having these discussions. If you are interested in expanding your operations into response, and then we're talking again about those critical responding hours, not the recovery period. And they can assist you in understanding how to do that in a way that honors that really complicated EOC hierarchy we were looking at before, and your safety as well as the safety of your clients. So some benefits to being part of a VOAD, again, if this is within your interests and within your abilities, our committees and task force, they go over kind of like current concerns, current issues, and then help discuss, what can we do as a program to improve delivery of services through the whole disaster cycle, but especially in response. I have worked a little bit with VOADs, and I have found them extremely productive and interesting, and they're very good at identifying blind spots, which is one of the biggest challenges, I think, to agencies who want to begin doing this work. There's federal advocacy and liaison representation. This is one of the most important parts of kind of developing your response kind of protocol is how can you liaise with local, federal governments, other agencies that are active. This will keep you in the know, and this will allow you to operate responsibly in the event of a disaster. The thing about, we were talking about self-deployment. The thing about self-deployment is that you are often an island, and that sounds extremely negative because that's not always a horrible thing, but the risk there is that you truly are in the dark as it relates sometimes to the inner workings, and if you don't know what is happening in a response as it relates to the federal, state, city level, you might miss out on really critical information that could lead to mistakes, lives lost. So I think that one of the biggest things that this offers your agency, even if you're not going to be active in the response period, is the ability to have that knowledge and understand what's actually going on. It's definitely enlightening, I think, when you're facing an event or a disaster. And then the peer-to-peer networking, which is really close to the liaising piece I was just telling you about. I'm so sorry about those horns. But being able to talk to other VOADs and collaborate, kind of figure out how you can help each other. During the New Orleans East tornado, there was a lot of collaborating, especially amongst food banks. And, it's important to understand your place in this really complicated process. And the VOAD connects you so that you're part of the moving pieces and not just trying to throw yourself in there and become part of it when it's a critical moment. It's really hard to respond to disasters appropriately, safely, and with meaning without doing the work beforehand. Another tool that I wanted to share with you is the United Nations Office of Coordination of Human Affairs toolkit. They have and I'll show you the link on the next page, they have an incredible toolkit for developing response teams. Again, this is a preparedness activity that allows you to actually be responders. Very few people can just respond without having any infrastructure in place. It happens. We see communities do it all the time, but agencies have different responsibilities. And you want to run this agency after. And sometimes you might find yourself exhausting your resources. You might not have the staff during or after the crisis. So this toolkit helps you develop teams and also identify if you can actually develop these teams. There's a lot of acronyms here, and it's not important that you understand them. These are, if you want to look into developing teams, they define all these acronyms on the first page for you. But what they're trying to do is help you develop teams that mitigate risk and response and deliver the best care that your agency can during the response period. So this isn't really a recovery manual. They have recovery materials, but they really focus on these 24 to 72 hour periods and help you create the best response that your agency specifically can. So again, there's the link down there, interactive.unocha.org. Again, developing response teams and assigning responder personnel. This also helps people in leadership positions figure out who on my team is going to be most able to manage our resources and services in times of duress. They have some very interesting tools that do that. They have technical team mobilization frameworks and assessing relief assets and relief assets and stockpiles. This is actually really interesting because they have a list of assets and stockpiles, but also the way in which you can procure these things. And this is something that I've not really seen. This information is usually sort of hard to come by. And, not every agency needs stockpiles. The city of New Orleans famously bought an incredible surplus of hazmat-related materials after the Ebola crisis was announced. And, that was an error in, considering need around relief assets and stockpiling. But this is actually something you can do as an agency if you identify a risk. Something like, hurricane management is absolutely a risk that you can look into stockpiling for. That's not inappropriate. But if there are these kind of last minute threats, OCHA really looks at them and then helps, point you towards the right providers and materials. So they're really good if you're trying to figure out, what do I need? What would I need? Is there anything we want to actually stockpile and use? Again, this is really big response stuff. Not every agency needs these sorts of things. So what can we do in a response period? What are we supposed to be doing? Again, not every agency is supposed to be responding. Not every agency wants to respond. And we don't always know if we'll have the staff, the resources, or even location to do so effectively, which is, why we talk about planning for it. But what we can do is disseminate information. We talked about this in week 1. So we can develop the protocols and all the communicative hierarchies beforehand so that when the response time comes, we can disseminate information. Some agencies become, this is especially in Southeast Asian models, like and in areas like Japan, in which community centers are identified and they're kind of 24/7 news resources. So, how do you want to disseminate information? Do you want to be somewhere people can come to for that information? Is this even within your capacity or interest? But however you do it, just make sure that you're disseminating that information appropriately. This is one big activity that can be done across the board. Act as an advocate. So this requires a lot of communication with those entities we were mentioning before. What are you seeing that maybe they're not seeing? Your population's best. If there is a disaster evacuation declared, who do you need to be advocating for? Are there people that you are aware do not have a voice? So acting as an advocate in that moment to have people and allow them to have people be able to access resources is a massive part of response, even if you do not plan to stay and work an entire response timeline. And then finally, maintain institutional composure. Sometimes maintaining institutional composure is deciding not to practice. It's deciding not to continue services or offer resources. I think one of the most important things an institution can do in the time of a crisis, disaster, major event is to really assess whether something can be done by the agency at all. Is it appropriate to be responding? And if you do respond, what is in place to allow you to maintain the integrity of the institution and, staff composure, the general composure of that institution? It's something that doesn't always get talked about or falls to the wayside in times of stress and crisis, which is understandable. But often it can really paint a picture in the recovery period of that institution, good or bad. Recovery is often where a lot of agencies redevelop identity, and you want it to be a good one. One tip that I have for you, I actually was thinking about this a lot this morning, I don't know why, but is to always be ready to update your information website. This sounds so silly and so obvious and probably a little dumb, but one frustration I always had as a emergency manager and someone who liaises a lot with emergency agencies was the inability to find any information at all about what their services were doing and when they'd be continuing in the event of a crisis. So, when you have there's that period, there's notification that something is going to be happening, something could potentially be happening. Stay on top of your social media, but also prepare something on your website, whether it's, a hidden page that you can bring to the front of your website as the homepage during a crisis that tells people how to manage their expectations of you, as well as the responsibilities that you will have during a crisis. And some of these might be really, simplistic. It might just be like, we're not operating. Maybe you're going to have something for each type of crisis or disaster, depending on the severity. But the most useful things people need to know is, how are you doing? Are you closed? Are you active in this disaster? It's as simple as saying on your website, having something pop up and saying, during this time, we are not anticipating offering services, or, better yet, we are closed. Or, we are offering services from time X to time Y, and here's what we're giving you. So what are we doing? What services are being offered, if any? How and when can they be accessed? Who is the point of contact? Again, this involves a lot of those preparedness activities of communication, as well as identifying leadership for this specific instance. And how can you engage in donations and volunteers? This is just a really good thing to have done or even built within your web manager before anything ever happens. You'll have to update it, of course, so that it relates to the context and time and disaster. But it is immeasurably easier to be able to just throw this all up during an event or, before an event, rather than giving this information after. Because some people might be looking to you as a primary source of information. Maybe you're the institution that they most trust. Maybe you're the first thought on volunteer and donation or donors' minds. So I always recommend, you can have a hidden little thing in your web management software, whatever you use, Wix, whatever, that you can pop up in the time of crisis that guides people through this experience as it relates to what you do in the community. This picture I included because this is an example of unmanaged disaster donations. Just like as a sidebar, interesting note, disaster donation behavior is really rough to tackle, and sometimes you're going to be overwhelmed. So it's good to have, something to steer people to before they decide what to do on your behalf. And then finally, something that you can do pretty much, as soon as starting this week or developing this kind of process is to play host to community forums. You're an expert in something, and every field relates to disaster and the needs in the post-disaster environment. So consider hosting a community forum specifically around disaster response, so you can understand what your resources are, what your community needs, what your community expects of you. Sometimes it's good to even just send out a survey, asking, what do you want to see from us, or what do you anticipate us doing in a crisis event? Sometimes those things, that sounds really simplistic. It also, might not be appropriate for your population, but it helps people manage expectations, but also opens you up to understanding how do people see us in the community in a time of crisis, a time in which things aren't running normally. So yeah, I recommend that you also get involved in the city-hosted drills. A Vacuteer and GOSEP and NOLA Ready operate a lot of these and partake in a lot of these. Um, you know, if you can start a coalition, that's incredible. Keeping in contact with people who have similar missions as you and abilities is a very good idea. And then again, developing materials. We've talked a lot about materials on paper, especially because we're worried about technology and access. But if you can develop materials that specifically talk about who you are in a response period or in the event of a disaster, your clients are going to better understand who you are to them in every aspect, in like every context of their interactions with you. And then finally, we kind of talked about this already, but staying up to date. Are we up to date on all current disaster knowledge? That's a big ask, but you know, attending trainings, talking to GOSEP and NOLA Ready, having the most recent materials. We talked a lot of this over the past 2 weeks, but it's good as a rule. Every 6 months to a year, update your disaster plan and communicate with the city about any possible new publications of materials. Again, look at roles, who's doing what, who can do what, you know, is this even our place if, you know, something should happen. And sometimes hosting these like preparedness parties. I know Vacuteer does a bye-bye hurricane party every year, and it brings a lot of community members in, and it's a really good time to discuss, you know, what was learned over the last year and what we hope to do or what is hoped to accomplish in the next year. So that concludes week 4. I'm going to put this on the back end of the website. Before I shut everything down, we have 6 minutes. If anyone has any questions or wants me to reiterate or go over anything I said. I'll type it in here just in case. Okay, great. So I think we're good. I really appreciate you all checking in today. Actually, Emily, would you mind telling me what organization you're from? But otherwise, that concludes our presentation for today. And I really look forward to seeing you guys next week for our last presentation where we'll talk about recovery and moving forward. Great. Thank you so much, everybody.